Welcome everyone to EROSS DER online summer seminars. I'm Giancarlo Guizzardi and I'm organizing this together with Enrico Franconi, Tiago Salles and Claudine Moraes. As I've been telling you for many weeks now, EROSS is connected to the 4 decades tradition of the International Conference on Conceptual Modeling, ER, but also to the Bolzano Summer of Knowledge. And this week we are actually properly overlapping with BOSC, with the Bolzano Summer of Knowledge, which started yesterday, and will last for the entire, for the remaining weeks of the month of September. So it's amazing. I'm very happy that our guest today is then also a keynote speaker for the entire Bolzano Summer of Knowledge. And I'm very happy with the choice of our speaker today. Cognitive science has 2 overarching goals. One is explanatory. By studying the cognitive abilities of humans and other animals, one formulates theories of different aspects of cognition. The other goal is constructive. By building artifacts, one attempts to construct systems that can accomplish various cognitive tasks. For both kinds of goals, a key problem is how the representations used by the cognitive systems are to be modeled in an appropriate way. So this was written by our guest in his introduction of the paper that presented the theory of conceptual space. So we are very happy to have here today Professor Peter Gärdenfors. He's probably the greatest living Swedish philosopher. He made seminal contributions to philosophy of science, decision theory, language evolution, and was already a key figure in the area of belief revision when he created one of the, as I said, current central notions in cognitive science, this theory of a conceptual space, which has been applied to robotics, linguistics, knowledge representation, conceptual modeling, among many other areas. He's a professor of cognitive science at Lund University in Sweden, recipient of many awards and prizes, including the Gad Rausing Prize for his contributions to humanities. He's a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, the German Academy for Natural Science, the Academia of Europe, Academia Europaea. He was for many years a member of the prize committee for the prize in economic science in memory of Alfred Nobel. In other words, the Nobel Prize for economics. He's the editor of 13 books and author of many other books, including the recent The Geometry of Meaning, Semantics Based on Conceptual Space by MIT Press, Conceptual Spaces, The Geometry of Thought, MIT Press as well, from 2004. The Dynamics of Thoughts, which was part of the prestigious Synthese Library. Knowledge in Flux, Modeling the Dynamics of Epistemic States, that was also published by MIT Press in '88, and How Homo Became Sapiens, The Evolution of Thinking, that was published by Oxford University Press, which is a very, very interesting book as well. And he also has one of the coolest offices that I've had the pleasure to visit in the Lund Tower for many, many years. So I'm very happy to have him here today talking about conceptual spaces, cognitive semantics, and robotics. Very happy to have you here. Peter Gärdenfors, welcome to EROSS.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to tell you, Giancarlo, I'm no longer sitting in this nice office in the tower. We've been moved to another place, but you will not see me in anything but my office at the moment. Thank you for this very generous introduction. I will continue on this topic of conceptual spaces, apply it to semantics, but basically my talk is about human-robot interaction, how we can make robots communicate in a natural way with humans. So the question is, how can we build up a semantic framework for an efficient human-robot interaction? That's the underlying question. I will not talk very much about implementations today. I will say a couple of words at the end. So this is mainly a theoretical talk presenting a semantic framework that will hopefully be applied and implemented in various robotic platforms. So let me start by saying, as a background, say something about how this fits into the context of AI. So in early AI, there were two main flavors. You had the symbolic representation, and you thought that you could represent everything in terms of logical formalism or some kind of programming code where you specified rules and you drew logical inferences and so on. But that very quickly came up against the frame problem and other problems. And later development try to get around this is then the work in formal ontologies. The second flavor is machine learning. There are different versions of it, but maybe the connectionist models are the most famous ones and the most used ones. But we all know the problems about how you learn in neural networks, and I will not talk about these problems here. So there has been development, and I would like to say that in current AI, the focus has been on categorizing things. I mean, you give an input, so you have face recognition, or you categorize all kinds of input images or other data. And the most famous method at the moment is probably deep learning. But from the theoretical point of view, that's not very much new. I mean, it's basically back propagation 2.0. You have more layers in the network, you have more training data. It's an amplification of back propagation, but it has had several successes in categorization. But of course, so this is the problem with neural networks. We don't really know what is learned, and we know that if the input data is biased, then its categorization will be biased in the same way, and so on. Now, if we turn to semantics, we can say that categorization gives us data for nouns and adjectives. We can sort things into different categories, and so we can put nouns as names on them. Maybe we can do similar things for adjectives. We can say that a certain color or a certain size or a certain shape is presented to the system. One thing that's been missing in general is verbs. We haven't had very good systems for classifying actions or other dynamic processes. So the categorization methods gives us some kind of input data for nouns and adjectives, but we basically need more for verbs. And I will talk about that a bit later today. We don't have very good models of reasoning. I mean, one of the first aims in the early AI was to have very developed models of reasoning. They didn't care very much about categorization, but now we have the categorization, but the reasoning has been put in the back a little bit in the current version. Now, I can already now reveal that I will propose an event structure as the semantic foundation, and I will present to you a model of events. But before we get there, I will have to talk about conceptual spaces and how we handle different word classes semantically. And I mean, that is how we handle nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, and so on, in a way that could possibly be implemented in AI and robotic systems. So I'm getting to the event structure, but before we get there, I have to do a little bit more on conceptual spaces. So that's my modeling tool. And before I get to conceptual spaces, I just want to point out that you can distinguish 3 levels of modeling in knowledge representation and machine learning. The first ones are the symbolic models, where you have a set of predicates, you have all kinds of logical operator. You're supposed to know the denotation of the predicates. That's something that has to be given to the system somehow. And then you do all kinds of tree searches and syntactic operations, and then you can draw inferences in a system like that. The problem is, of course, where do the predicates come from? And this problem has never really been solved in the symbolic model tradition. Then we have the connectionist models that I already talked about. And then you can pick out, you can categorize, and you can generate new predicates by learning in these networks. But the problem is that we don't really know what is represented in the network. And in general, learning is very slow. You have to train these systems on a lot of input data. I'm proposing a middle level here in terms of representational granularity. I mean, on the symbolic level, you have the predicates given. On the connectionist level, you generate predicates. But on the conceptual level, you organize things into geometric structures, or what I call quality dimensions. And you represent terms represent the items in terms of geometrical notions like convexity and vector spaces and so on. And of course, these dimensions don't come for free. We can maybe pick them up from a connectionist model, but that's a general problem of this. But anyway, I want to put in this conceptual level as a kind of mid-size level of representation in knowledge representation. So now let me say something about conceptual spaces, and I presented that in the first book that Giancarlo mentioned, the Conceptual Spaces book. So the basic idea is that you have a number of dimensions. That's the building blocks. So these can be dimensions of color, of size, or of shape, or weight, location, temperature, I don't know what. I mean, there are lots of possible dimensions that you can represent in a knowledge-based system. And they come with some structures, and I will talk about these structures very soon. But we sort them into domains. So the color space has 3 different dimensions. Size has 1 dimension. Shape has, we don't really know how shape space looks like. Location space have 3 dimensions, the width, height, and depth. Force is a vector, and so on. So, but these dimensions, we sort them into domains, like the color domain or the force domain, and so on. So I will talk about the domains. And then a concept, in my terminology, is a region of a conceptual space. And I add this notion of a convex region. And that's a very central geometric notion in my theory here. So let me just give you a trivial example. Those of you who know something about conceptual spaces will recognize this because this is the standard example. So you have the color space. So there are 3 dimensions. This is the brightness going from white to black. You have the hue going from red to blue to green to yellow and back to red again. That is a circular dimension because you can talk about complementary colors. And then you have the intensity going from gray in the middle and then bright, I should say clearer or more intense colors as you go out to the rim of this. And this is a model of human perception of colors. Now we have, in different languages, we have different words for colors, but in most languages there is a word for red, and now I only have a 2-dimensional circle here, but in general it's a 3-dimensional region of this color spindle. And my point here is that it's convex. That means if one point is called red, say this point, and another point is called red, then anything in between is also called red. I mean, that's the basic idea of convexity. And this convexity idea improves learning possibility and generalization and stuff like that. So it's a really a useful condition that concepts should be convex. So that's the only thing I want to say at the moment about conceptual spaces. The next topic is to have a representation of word classes. I mean, if you work with logic or programming languages, you only distinguish between predicates and variables or individuals. But in ordinary languages, there are different word classes. I mean, the predicates are divided up into adjectives, nouns, and so on. And one question is, of course, why do we have these word classes? And in linguistics, they are defined syntactically. But I want to give a cognitive representation. And each use of a word is supposed to belong to a single class. When you see a word, you're supposed to know whether it's a verb or a noun or a preposition. But there are words. I mean, in English, we can find a word like round that can belong to several word classes. So identifying which word class is maybe not always trivial. But my goal is not to give a syntactic definition of word classes, but to give a cognitively grounded theory of the semantics of word classes. I think there are there are good reasons to define word classes in terms of their semantic features. So this is what I want to do the next part of my talk. So let's start with simple words like adjectives. And adjectives, this is my thesis, is that an adjective describes as a convex region in a single domain. So we have adjectives for colors, we have adjectives for sizes, we have adjectives for shapes, we have adjectives for temperature and so on. But an adjective only deals with a single domain. So an adjective, in my terminology, expresses a property. Properties live on single domains as I describe properties. So here are some examples of adjectives. The word heavy refers to the weight dimension, hot refers to the temperature domain, bitter to the taste domain. There are many dimensions in the taste domain, and round refers to the shape domain. Now, the idea that the adjectives correspond to convex regions in a single domain will have consequences. Okay, I have here one representation of this is the temperature dimension. So we can have one part of it is the cold part of the temperature, another is the hot part, and then you have a middle part that in many cases is not given a word. Some languages have words for the middle part, like English has lukewarm, but many languages don't have a particular word for this middle, neither cold nor hot part of the temperature dimension. But of course, on a single dimension, it's very easy to have that the part of it that will be a convex region of the temperature dimension, and that will be a convex region. And this is what hot and cold refers to. So that's a very simple illustration when we have one-dimensional structures. But my thesis has consequences. So if we go back to the color space, there is no adjective I would predict in no natural languages that means green or orange, because this region, green or orange, is not convex. So that would not be a natural world in any language. And there is no adjective that means long and hot, because long is the size dimension and hot is the temperature dimension. So that would be an adjective that combines several domains. And in general, we don't find adjectives like this. So this thesis that an adjective can be described as the convex region in a single domain is empirically testable. We can maybe discuss it afterwards if you like. That's what I want to say about adjectives and their relation to regions in a single domains. Now we go to nouns. And then we take a simple noun like apple. So apple has values in several domains. Apples have colors, and they normally fall within a convex region of the color space. They have a taste, and taste consists of sweet, sour, bitter, and salty, and maybe umami as well. But when it comes to apples, it's mainly concerned with sweet and sour part of the taste space. And then you have apples have shapes. We all know what shapes apples have and how they distinguish from oranges and pears in terms of shape. But there are also other dimensions. We can learn more as we learn more about apples. We can learn about their nutrition values and some other factors about apples. When kids learn about apple, they learn about color, taste, and shape. So the number of domains that are associated with apple can increase over time as we learn more about the concept. The semantics of a concept is not fixed in my theory. But the point is that an object noun like apple consists of information from several domains. And so I defined an object category as a number of convex regions in different domains. And then there is more information. There is some values are more important than other ones. Maybe color is not the most important part of an apple category. Maybe the taste is more important. But also the domains are correlated, or the regions. So a red apple is more likely to be sweet than a green apple is. There is a correlation between the color of a fruit and its sweetness, and that comes in our knowledge of objects. So an object category is more complicated than an adjective, which only concerns one domain or a property. So adjectives denote properties, nouns denote, well, not just object categories, because there are many different kinds of nouns. But I would say that we can also identify certain classes of nouns by the domains. So if we look at nouns denoting places, they only require the space domain. We identify a place by its location in ordinary space. We identify mass nouns if we talk about things like silver or water or flower or sand. They don't refer to the shape domain. I mean, when we talk about water, we don't care about the shape of the water and so on. In contrast to object nouns that has or concrete nouns that require these object category domains like size and shape and color and so on. And then we have the abstract nouns. They are not located in space. I mean, the concrete nouns and mass nouns, they are all located. I mean, all these types are located in space. Abstract nouns are not located in space. And then we can identify agents. Agents are things that can do things, and in order to do things, you must be able to exert forces in actions. I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. And then, of course, you have intentional agents that have goals. So they must have representations of the goal domain. These are just some examples of how you can classify nouns by which domains they allow and which domains they don't allow and so on. But this is a topic that I haven't really worked out, but I just want to show that the idea of domains can be used in analyzing different kinds of nouns. So that's nouns. Let's go to verbs. And now I show you a short movie here. You see some black spots here, and I'll try to show you just a little bit of the movie. Yeah, a couple of 100 milliseconds of this movie, and you immediately see that this is a person walking. And if I show you a movie, you can see different actions that this person is performing. The point here is that you see very little. You don't see the shape of the person, you don't see the color of the person, you don't see the size of the person, you only see the movements. But these movements are sufficient for you to identify the action within tenths of a second. So this shows that we need very little information to identify an action. And my hypothesis here is that what you see is a pattern of forces. You see these moving dots, and your brain immediately extracts the forces that are behind these movements. We are good Newtonians, and we take the second derivative and find the forces. And an action, this is my hypothesis here, is that we identify an action by these patterns of forces. I mean, if you have a human body, there are different parts, so it's body parts that so it's a pattern of forces that comes out of it. But we do this, we identify the actions immediately and very efficiently. And we also see that actions are similar. I mean, running is similar to jogging, and it's more similar to jogging than it is to crawling. And we can also show that they have the actions have prototype effects. They are more or less standard ways of walking. Some of you may have seen Monty Python's Silly Walks, which are really non-standard types of walking. So we find prototype effects and similarities among actions as well. And then I define, again, an action concept is a convex region, but now in another space, in the space of force patterns. And I will not give you a formal definition of what the space of force patterns is, because I don't have one. But basically, we just as we don't have a formal definition of the space of shapes, but still we know how to identify the actions, and we can test this convexity idea. And some people have done it, and it gives support to this idea that action concepts are convex regions. So now I want to use this idea about representing actions for representing verb meanings. And there are two types of verbs, but still, I formulate a thesis concerning the semantics of verbs, or verb roots, because I don't care about the syntax here. Now is as a convex region of vectors that depend only on a single domain. So this is almost the same as for the adjectives, except that now I talk about vectors rather than points in spaces here. And we can have some examples. So we have the verb to push. So that refers to force vector in the force space. So that's the force domain. That is a multidimensional domain, and maybe we can even talk about the patterns of forces, which is a more complicated space. The verb to move refers to changes in the spatial domain. When you move a thing, it goes from one location in space to another location. So that's a vector, and moving is all these vectors. And if you talk about heating some food or heating something else, that refers to the temperature domain, and then heating refers to changes, that is vectors in temperature space. So you have two types of verb meanings here. One is okay. I should get back to that. Yeah, I can say it already now. There are those that refer to the force domain, and I will call these verbs the manner verbs. They talk about how you do something. And then you have the result verbs, like something moves or something is heated, refers to the result of the action, and there are changes in properties. So the results are changes in properties. Before I get to that, I want to say that also, like in the case for adjectives, there are no verbs that mean walk and burn, because that's several domains, and there are no verbs that mean crawl or run, because that's a non-convex region of the force space. So also for the verb representation, we get similar predictions here concerning what kind of verbs you find in natural languages. So from this theory, we can make predictions. We can talk about similarity of verb meanings. We can say that jogging is like running, but it's slower. So there is a similarity of the force patterns involved in jogging and running, or in jogging and walking, for instance. We can say that these are more similar than other types of movements. We can explain subcategories of verbs because, for example, there are many subcategories of walking. Some of them are, English is really rich in verbs that describe different kinds of walking, but they all are sub-regions of the walking region of force space. So marching is walking with stiff legs, and so on. And then we can also explain metaphorical use of verbs. So I can say we are moving the meeting to Friday. Then we make a metaphorical mapping of the time to space. And so we are moving the meeting in time rather than in space. And vacuuming with his mouth, that was a boy who had spilled milk on the table, and he sucked it up, and then he said he was vacuuming the milk with his mouth, which is, I think, is a nice metaphor. Slice a tennis ball. When you slice a tennis ball, you perform the same movement with your hand as when you're slicing bread. Eat up a profit is an abstract metaphor where profit is seen as some kind of food that you can consume, and you can explain these metaphorical use of verbs by looking at the mappings between the different domains here. And also my division into different domains predict this division into manner and result verbs, as I said earlier. So manner verbs describe force vectors, and they function as causes in events, and result verbs describe result vectors. So once we have this division of what if a verb depends on the force domain or if it depends on other domains, we get for free this division of into manner and result verbs. Now that was the verbs. Now we get to prepositions, and again I put forward a very similar thesis that prepositions denote convex region in a single domain. They are not adjectives, they're a little bit different, but I don't want to get into the details here. So we have very many prepositions deal with the spatial domain, above, under, on top of, and so on, behind, before, in front of, and so on. But actually quite a number of prepositions like in, on, and even over depend on the force domain. Over is a force preposition, above is a spatial domain preposition. There are a couple of prepositions like before and after and during that depend on the time domain. And then there are even abstract prepositions like despite that depend on a more epistemic domain. And I don't really want to tell you what this epistemic domain consists of. But my point is that we have different prepositions. Again, they only refer to a convex region in a single domain. A complicating factor here is that we have lots of metaphorical uses of prepositions, and that makes it difficult to analyze how they work. But I'll save that for another occasion. Now, to sum up, I've given you some of the geometric structures for different word classes, or for some of the word classes. So adjectives refer to regions of domains. I talked about that. Nouns refer to regions of products of domains. So in each domain, it's a convex region, but the noun is a product of domains. And these domains can even be expanded as we learn more. Verbs refer to vector regions of domain. What distinguishes prepositions from adjectives is that prepositions are based on landmarks, and I didn't talk about that, but that's the distinction between adjectives and adjectives and prepositions. Adverbs I haven't talked about. Some of them function as multipliers of vectors. Demonstratives like here, there, and so on refer to regions of perceptual domain, and quantifiers are properties about sets. If you want to ask me, we can talk about that later. But basically, this slide shows that I've given some kind of geometric structure for each of the word classes, and when we specify these geometric structures, we will see that they correspond to different types of structures, and then within each of these types, we can talk about convex regions. And for many of them, actually for adjectives, verbs, prepositions, adverbs, and demonstratives, they only concern a single domain. So I get a lot of mileage out of this idea that words refer to convex regions in single domain. The main exception is, of course, nouns, where you have they refer to several domains. So that's the conceptual space analysis of different word classes. Now, when we communicate, we don't only use single words, but we combine words. So the question is, what happens to the meanings when we combine them? And this is a complicated matter. I mean, this is not just taking intersections or products of word meanings, because we have lots of context effects. When we combine an adjective like red with other nouns, we get different outcomes. So red book has really the classical red color, but the red wine is more violet or purple. A red skin is not red. It's still beige, but it is a little bit reddish, but it's not really the red in the same way as a red book is. And red hair is copper. So the meaning of red changes depending on what it's combined with. So let me just show you my analysis of what happens here. So let's have a look at the space of skin colors. We say that there are white people and black people and red people and yellow people and so on. We have a lot of color terminology for different kinds of people. But if you look at the white person, that person is not really white, but it has a color something like in this part of the color space. And if you look at the black person, they don't have a color of real black. And if you look at the red person, they are not very clearly red, and so on. So these yellow blobs are supposed to represent the possible skin colors of different persons. And what happens in my analysis here is that this space of possible skin colors is embedded in a smaller color space, this smaller color space here. And it's in relation to this smaller color space that we talk about white people and black people and red people. So the relations between the colors are still the same. They are preserved, but their location in the big color space, they are different. So when we make the combinations of an adjective with a adjective with a noun, then you get a shift in the meaning of the adjective, and depending on what contrast clause it's combined with. So there is a lot of things to do concerning how word meanings combine. I only talked about adjectives and nouns. Here we can talk about noun-verb combination and so on. And of course, we want to get down to sentences. So in all languages, we have units of speech that we call sentences. So the question is, why do we speak in sentences? And a linguist would say, yeah, because it's grammatical. And I think that answer is a bit empty, because they take the sentence as the huge grammatical unit, and we don't really know. I mean, you can break it down, say the sentence consists of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, or several, and a verb phrase can be broken down into a verb phrase and another verb noun phrase and so on. But that doesn't answer the question of why do we speak in sentences. What is so special about the semantics of a sentence? And if you're a logician, you would say that, okay, a sentence expresses a proposition has a truth value. But what is a proposition? And in philosophy, people try to answer that, but from a cognitive point of view, me being a cognitive scientist, I'm not very satisfied with treating sentences as expressing propositions. It doesn't tell me very much. So my solution, and this is my second big thesis here, is that sentences are about events. They can be about special cases of events, like states. If I say that this cup is white, then this is a state. But still, it states some special cases of events. So this is my general semantic answer of what is the meaning of a sentence. Well, they express events. So let me expand on that. I want to give you a very simple model of an event. So I call this the two-vector model of an event. An event consists of an agent doing something, and the agent exerts a force vector on the patient. This is the object that something is happening to. There is something happening to the patient. And then as a result of the action, something happens to the patient. There is a result vector. If it's a state, nothing happens, and the force vector is nil. But in general, this is my model here. So the force vector or the force pattern acts on a patient, and that comes from the force space generated by an action, as I've analyzed actions earlier in terms of these force patterns. And then the result vector describes the changes of the properties of the patient. And these can be changes in location, as when you're moving something, or it can be changing in category space when you're heating something or painting something or whatever you're doing with the thing. Sometimes we don't even need an agent. We can cross it out because the force comes from something else. I mean, when something is falling, then the gravitation acts as the force, and we don't want to call the gravitation an agent. Or sometimes the force comes from inside the patient. When a tree is growing, then we can say that, the agent is the patient. And if I'm walking, then I'm exerting the force on myself. So or if I'm waving, I'm both the agent and the maybe not in the case of waving. I'm waving. That could be an intentional action. But anyway, sometimes the agent is the same as the patient here. But this is a very simple model of an event. Now let's see what we can do in terms of semantics with this model. Here is a very simple example. I mean, this is the agent, a person pulling an object, which is the patient. This is the force vector, and that is the result vector. The sled moves up the hill here. The force vector doesn't have the same direction as the result vector because there are other things involved, like other forces, like gravitation, for instance, going in this direction. The force vector doesn't have to be in parallel with the result vector. But that's a simple example of how an event can be represented. Now let's turn to event semantics. And different entities have different roles in events. I already talked about agent, patient, action, and result. But in some cases, you have recipients. I mean, if I give something to somebody else, there is a recipient. You have two patients, you can say. And sometimes the agent does things via an instrument. I cut the log with an axe. The axe is used to amplify my forces. I'm acting on the axe, and the axe acts on the log, and that will be an instrument. So events can be more complicated than just the four factors I described initially. But I don't have time to get into the details here. But I'm sorry. Linguists have been studying these thematic roles, as they are called in linguistics. And then you can use event representation to talk about expectations. And I have analyzed the role of expectations in reasoning in some cases. So they are kind of important. So when you perform an action, you're expecting a result. And when an agent is doing something, you expect something to happen to the patient and so on. So in event semantics has built into it a lot of expectations about consequences of various actions, or expectations about causes of certain effects and so on. And these expectations partly control the attention of the speaker and the listener when we are describing events. I said that we can also talk about causal relations in events, because the force vector functions as the cause of something, and the result vector describes the effect. So in most philosophical theories, cause and effect are of the same kind. But here I want to distinguish them. A cause is something that relates to the force domain, and the effect relates to other domains. And Judea Pearl, who has thought a lot about how to represent causation in computational terms, he says that we need really causal reasoning tools in order to speed up the learning of learning machines. So I totally agree with this. What we don't agree about is what is the best way to represent causal relations. But that's another story. Okay, so sentences refer to aspects of events. So I have this very general thesis here that a sentence expresses a part of an event or a state involving at least a force or a result vector and one entity. So we can have different combinations of force, result vectors, and agents and patients. And typically, patients and agents are represented by noun phrases, and the vectors, the force and the result vectors, are represented by verb phrases. And a sentence focuses on some parts of an event. An event can be very complicated. As I said, it can have many components. And in a sentence, you need not express all components of an event. You cannot give a complete description, but you have to focus on certain part. And that focus is a kind of attention process. So just to take a simple example, in the active sentence, Victoria hits Oscar. Victoria is the agent, Oscar is the patient, but here the focus is on Victoria performing this hitting. But in the passive sentence, Oscar was hit by Victoria, then the Oscar is still the patient, but here he becomes the subject of the sentence, and Victoria is the object here. So this mapping from agent and patient to subject and object is a question of where do you put your focus on in your description. There is no obvious mapping here. So in general, you have this model. So in a sentence, you would use a noun to describe the agent, and it would be an agent noun that is a noun that can perform actions. Patient is also a noun, but that can be any kind of noun, basically. Force vector is expressed by a manner verb, and the result vector is described by a result verb. So when you want to describe an event, you have to construe a linguistic expression for it. And there are many possible construals here. So I would focus on sentences that only have these 4 components. I mean, there are sentences that have other components as well. But if you have these 4 components, you can say that you can combine the agent and the force and say that she scrubs. That's an intransitive verb in this case. You can combine the agent and the result. She cleans. You can say that you can combine the force and the patient, say that the table was scrubbed. You can combine the patient and the result and say that the table was cleaned. You can combine the agent, the force, and the patient and say that she scrubs the table. You can combine a PR and say that she cleans the table. Or you can have all 4. She scrubs the table clean. And these are all different descriptions of the same event. And when we speak, we have to choose a particular construal, and that depends on what we want to focus on, what we choose here. So yeah, that's how we get from these thematic roles, the agent, force, patient, and result, to sentence expressions here. Now let me say that this ends my presentation of how to represent word classes and how to represent sentences. Now let's get to computational implementations. And when I developed this in my book on the geometry of meaning, I wasn't aware of Peter Domenech's model of reservoir computing. We have developed this quite in parallel. So what he has is that he has an input, a sentence like John was hit by Mary, and he has a mechanism for classifying these into word classes. And then his reservoir, this is a neural network, sorts them into either predicate, agent, object, or recipient. The main difference here is that he includes the recipients. I do that sometimes, but he doesn't distinguish the predicate into manner verbs and result verbs, or into force vectors and result vectors. So that's a main distinction that we don't find main distinction in my model that we don't find in the earlier version of his model. But then he assigns these words these different thematic roles. So John is assigned the object here, hit is assigned the predicate, the word Mary is assigned the agent. So this is done by the neural network. And this system works actually quite well, except that he can't distinguish between the 2 different kinds of verbs. So we work together in an EU project, and then I convinced him to expand this model into added the distinction between the force vector and the result vector. So grasp is then a verb that is a force vector, while has is a result vector. You have a thing and so on. And then we have an attention, and you have a construal formation, and you determine whether you want to focus on the force or the result, and then you generate, this is generating a sentence. And you have a similar inverse process for the sentence comprehension model. I don't want to get into detail here, but I want to show you how this works out in a real experiment. So this work was done by a PhD student at that time, Anne-Laure Mellier in Lyon. And here is a movie where she is interacting with an iCub. And so she's saying sentences. She's giving the instructions to the iCub, and she's asking questions. And when she asks questions about how something is done, then the answer should be a manner verb. And when she asks questions about what happened, the answer should be a result verb. So now you will see how the robot will answer the different kinds of questions. So this is Anne-Laure asking.
I want you to understand language.
I don't know if you can hear her, but at least you can read the text.
Before you push the cursor on the right, point to the cube.
So she gives a instruction in 2 actions: push and point. No, first point, then put. Now the guy thinks and comes up with a scheme. First point, then push. And now it points a bit awkwardly to the cube, and then it pushes the crocodile, and luckily enough the crocodile doesn't fall down this time. Many times it fell down when the robot did this action. Now comes the question part.
Yes. What did you do?
I'm going to take the cue.
And then? What happened?
The critical moved on the right.
This is what happened. The crocodile moved. That's a result vector. How did it happen? It's pushed by me. How is a manner
I
vector?
pushed the critical on the right.
And then?
I have no more information.
Yeah, then he's told everything. That's
Tell me about
enough. Yeah,
symptoms.
and that's the end of it. So that's an example of how we can use the manner of result verbs to analyze inputs and outputs. If you look at the robotics tradition, a lot of emphasis has been put on result verbs, and most verb analysis in human-robot interactions has been things like move and have and things, the result verbs. But you also need an analysis of manner verbs. And for that, you need to categorize actions. I mean, the robot has to see an action and has to categorize it. So as part of this EU project, we worked here in Lund Cognitive Science. I had a PhD student, Sarah Gary, who developed a neural network system together with Magnus Jonsson, who was the expert here. And we used self-organizing maps. And the input was these Kinect movies. They looked like the movies that I showed you earlier of movements. So very little information, just the movement of the limbs. And basically these are, in this case, we only do arm movements, one arm movement actions here. And these are 6 types of actions that we analyzed. So first there was a pre-processing of this movement. You adjusted the size of the figure and you adjusted the direction in 3D of the figure. So you got uniform representations. Then these sequences were fed into a self-organizing map that learned these sequences of positions in the self-organizing map. And these vectors were then categorized in a second layer self-organizing map. So it learned to categorize the different vector patterns here, and that was given to an output layer where you had different names for the actions. So let me show you a movie that shows you a little bit of this, and that was done in real time. We had a person standing in front of a Kinect camera and doing one of these 6 actions, or I think there was 10 actions in this experiment. I've forgotten. You will see, and what you see here is the input, and that's in slow motion. And here is the classification, the 10 different or 8 different actions. This is the desired outcome. And here you see and what's happening at the moment. Now it's come to front wave, and that's the correct answer. And then the action goes on a little bit, and it's still a front wave. Then we get to the next action, which is let's see when it starts. And next is tennis swing. So now you get guesses from the system, and then they flash up here. There's a front wave. Now you get the tennis swing after a certain number of frames from this Kinect movie. Third one is draw circle. So the hand is moving. You get guesses here. High wave. Now it's not a high wave, but after a little bit you get to draw circle here. So this is actually in real time. We trained this system to identify 10 actions. It's on this line, yeah, and to separate them out, and it worked quite well. The accuracy was quite good. So this is an example of how we can use a visual input to generate manner verbs. But the robotic systems are not really good, and still, I mean, we are on this experimental level still here. So I've now given you a story consisting of first a presentation of the conceptual spaces, and then analyzing word classes in conceptual spaces. Then I've talked about event representation in order to generate robot semantics. And actually, most of my talk has been based on this paper that came out last year in the ACM transactions here. The examples of the robot and the manner and the Lyon example with Anne-Laure Mellier is in interaction studies, and this example with the online recognition is in the BICA journal. So these are, if you want to read more about my work here. These are the three main references that I built my presentation on. So thank you very much for attending this, and now I hope you have understood what I've been talking about. Otherwise, you will have to ask me questions in the question period.